The health inspector who walked into Stone's Seafood that Saturday morning wasn't really a health inspector, and the CEO sitting in booth 7 the week before ordering lobster tail wasn't really a maintenance worker. The empire everyone thought was built on fresh premium seafood was actually built on lies that were about to cost 40 locations and 3,000 jobs everything they had. But nobody knew that yet, especially not the two waitresses who were about to accidentally destroy a $100 million company with a single conversation about frozen fish. Rewind 1 week. The moment David Stone ordered the lobster tail at his own restaurant, he wasn't expecting his life to unravel before dessert arrived. He sat in booth 7 wearing a borrowed maintenance uniform and a baseball cap pulled low, clipboard resting on the worn vinyl seat beside him. This was supposed to be reconnaissance, the kind CEOs do when they want to feel connected to the ground floor. What he got instead was a front row seat to corporate fraud, and the two waitresses whispering near the kitchen door had no idea they'd just detonated a bomb under everything he'd built. "Did you see Table 9's lobster?" the younger one, Amy, asked her coworker as she balanced 3 plates on her forearm with practiced ease. Frozen solid when it came out of the box, still had that weird label, the one we're supposed to peel off before plating. Her voice carried just enough across the half-empty dining room that David's fork stopped midway to his mouth. The older waitress, Janet, glanced toward the kitchen with the expression of someone who'd seen too much and said too little for too long. "The fake ones," she replied quietly, her tone matter-of-fact in a way that suggested this wasn't news but routine. "Corporate sends them down twice a week now. Manager said to just switch the labels in the walk-in and nobody notices the difference." David set his fork down carefully, the sound of metal on ceramic suddenly too loud in his ears. His lobster tail sat before him, butter pooling around its edges, looking exactly like every promotional photo his marketing team had used for the past 6 months. He'd built Stone's Seafood Company from a single food truck into a 40-location empire by promising one thing above everything else: fresh, premium seafood at honest prices. His father had been a fisherman in Maine, had taught him the difference between dayboat catch and freezer trash before he could tie his own shoes. This restaurant, this specific location in downtown Portland, was supposed to be the flagship, the crown jewel, the place where corporate executives brought clients to showcase what American dining could be when it refused to cut corners. And here were two waitresses, casually discussing systematic fraud, like they were talking about the weather. He looked down at his plate again, really looked this time, and saw what he'd missed in his first eager glance. The texture was too uniform, the color slightly off, that telltale translucence that frozen seafood gets when it's been thawed too quickly. His stomach turned, not from disgust at the food itself, but from the implications spreading through his mind like cracks in ice. How long had this been happening? How many locations? Who authorized it? The questions piled up faster than he could process them, each one leading to darker possibilities. David pulled out his phone beneath the table and opened the encrypted messaging app he used with his executive team. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then stopped. Who could he trust? His COO, Richard, had been pushing aggressive cost-cutting measures for the past year, insisting that customers couldn't tell the difference between premium and mid-grade product if the presentation was right. His VP of Operations, Linda, had implemented the new supplier contracts last quarter, the ones that had mysteriously improved their margins by 18%. Even his head chef at corporate, someone he'd personally mentored for 5 years, had been oddly quiet during the last quarterly review when David questioned the sudden spike in food costs at some locations versus others. The waitresses had moved on, their conversation shifting to weekend plans and a coworker's birthday party, but David couldn't move past what he'd heard. He forced himself to take a bite of the lobster, chewing slowly, analyzing. It wasn't terrible, that was almost the worst part. It was acceptable, good enough to fool most diners who'd never had the real thing, who trusted that a restaurant with Stone's reputation wouldn't serve them garbage with a gourmet label. But it wasn't what they'd paid $28 for, and it sure as hell wasn't what his name stood for. He thought about his father, about those early morning trips to the docks, about the old man's calloused hands sorting through the day's catch with an expert eye that could spot quality in the dim pre-dawn light. You put your name on something, his father had told him 1,000 times. You stake your reputation on every single plate. People trust you with their time and their money and their special occasions, and if you betray that, you don't get it back. David had carved those words into the mission statement, had repeated them in every investor meeting and employee orientation. Apparently, somewhere between vision and execution, his own company had decided his father's principles were negotiable. He needed proof, real documentation, that would hold up not just in a termination hearing but potentially in court, if this went as deep as his gut was telling him it did. David signaled for the check, paid cash, and left a generous tip that Amy would remember later as either ironic or appropriate, depending on how the next few weeks unfolded. Then he walked out into the October drizzle, pulled out his phone, and made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Malcolm Reed answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that same gravelly skepticism that had made him legendary in restaurant industry consulting before he'd retired to write scathing exposés about corporate food service fraud. David, his old friend, said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd been expecting this call eventually. What finally happened? "I need an auditor," David replied, walking toward his car with purpose now, his mind already 3 steps ahead. "Someone who knows seafood supply chains and isn't on my payroll. Someone who can trace product from dock to plate without leaving fingerprints. And I need it done in 72 hours before whoever's running this operation gets wind that I'm looking." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You're going scorched earth," Malcolm observed. "This isn't about firing a manager, is it? This is about burning down your own house to see what crawls out of the ashes." David unlocked his car and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the restaurant through the rain-streaked windshield. "If my house is built on fraud," he said quietly, "then it deserves to burn. I just need to know how many people are holding the matches." 3 days, Malcolm confirmed. "But David, if this is what I think it is, if this goes up the chain the way these things usually do, you're about to learn some very unpleasant truths about people you trust. Some of them might be unfixable." "Then I'll fix what I can and cut out what I can't," David replied, and ended the call. He sat there for another 10 minutes, watching employees come and go through the back entrance, wondering which of them knew, which were complicit, which were just following orders from people who should have known better. Finally, he started the engine and drove not home but to his lawyer's office, because this wasn't just about product fraud anymore. This was about salvaging a reputation, protecting customers who'd trusted his brand, and potentially rebuilding his entire company from the foundation up. The rain fell harder as evening settled over Portland, and David Stone, CEO of a 40-location seafood empire, began planning the systematic dismantling of everything he thought he knew about his own business. What he didn't know yet was that the fake lobster was just the appetizer, and the real revelation was still waiting in the walk-in freezer, with a mislabeled box and a shipping manifest that would lead him straight to his own executive suite. Malcolm's auditor arrived Saturday morning disguised as a health inspector, complete with county credentials that would pass casual scrutiny and a tablet loaded with legitimate inspection protocols. Her name was Claire Hopkins, and she'd spent 15 years with the FDA before going private, which meant she knew exactly where bodies got buried in food service operations and exactly how to exhume them without anyone noticing until it was too late. David met her in a coffee shop 6 blocks from the flagship location, both of them pretending to be strangers who happened to sit near each other. "She's good," Malcolm had promised during their midnight call. "She'll find everything, and she'll document it in ways that'll hold up in federal court if it comes to that." "You sure you want to know everything, David? Because once you do, you can't unknow it." That was the question, wasn't it? David had spent the past 3 nights barely sleeping, going through financial records and supplier contracts in his home office, finding discrepancies that seemed innocuous individually but formed a pattern when viewed collectively. Invoices that didn't quite match inventory reports, supplier agreements with companies he'd never heard of, approved by executives who should have run them past him first. Email chains he wasn't copied on, discussing product substitutions and margin improvements in language that was just vague enough to provide plausible deniability. The deeper he dug, the more he realized this wasn't some rogue manager at a single location cutting corners for a bonus. This was systematic, organized, and it had been running for at least 18 months based on the paper trail. Claire slid a folder across the table without looking at him, her eyes on her phone as if she was scrolling through social media. Inside were her credentials, her inspection schedule, and a burner phone number. "I'll start with the flagship today," she said quietly, still not making eye contact. "Monday, I'll hit 3 more locations randomly selected from your mid-tier markets. Wednesday, I'll inspect your primary warehouse and distribution center. By Thursday morning, you'll have a full report with photographic evidence, supply chain documentation, and witness statements from employees who don't know they're witnesses. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Mr. Stone, Malcolm briefed me on what you overheard. If I find what I think I'm going to find, this isn't a PR problem you can spin. This is RICO territory, if there's organized deception across state lines. Are you prepared for that?" David thought about his father again, about integrity being the only thing you take to the grave that actually matters. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make this right," he replied. "Even if it costs me everything." "Good answer," Claire said, and finally looked at him directly. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, the gaze of someone who'd seen every variation of corporate corruption and hadn't become cynical so much as precisely calibrated. "Because it probably will cost you everything, at least the version of everything you have right now. But you'll sleep better, and that's worth more than most people realize until they can't anymore." She left first, walking out into the gray morning with her inspection tablet and her county credentials, and David sat there for another 20 minutes, drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching the door she'd exited through like it was a portal to a future he couldn't quite visualize yet. Then his phone buzzed with a text from Richard, his COO. "Board meeting moved up to Monday morning," the message read. "Linda wants to discuss Q4 projections and the new supplier efficiency metrics. Should be good news all around." David stared at the words supplier efficiency metrics and felt something cold settle in his chest. They were going to present fraud as success, probably with PowerPoint slides and projected savings, and they expected him to smile and approve it. He typed back a brief confirmation, then added a sentence that would seem innocuous but would matter later. "Let's make sure we have complete documentation on all supplier changes and product substitutions for the past 2 years. Want to really understand the full picture before we celebrate." The reply came back fast, almost too fast. "Of course, already prepared that for you. You're going to love what we've accomplished." David pocketed his phone and left the coffee shop, spending the rest of the day doing something he rarely did anymore. He visited 4 of his restaurants unannounced, sitting at bars, eating meals, watching operations with new eyes. At the second location, he saw the same thing, a freezer box being carried in from a delivery truck with a label that got peeled off and replaced before the contents went into storage. At the third location, he overheard a line cook complaining to another about the new fish being harder to work with. Not as fresh. Doesn't hold temp the same way. By the fourth location, David didn't need to order anything. He just sat in his car in the parking lot and watched the delivery process, saw the casual efficiency with which his own employees had been trained to perpetrate fraud, and realized they probably didn't even think of it as fraud. They thought of it as following company protocol, doing what management required, keeping their jobs in an industry where jobs were hard to keep. That night, David's wife found him in his office at 2 a.m, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, his face illuminated by the blue glow of spreadsheets that told stories of systematic betrayal. "You haven't slept in days," Jessica said from the doorway, concern evident in her voice. "What's happening?" He told her everything, the lobster, the waitresses, the fake labels, the scope of what he was beginning to understand. Jessica had been with him since the food truck days, had worked double shifts serving customers while he negotiated with suppliers, had believed in the dream as much as he had. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she sat down across from him with the expression of someone preparing for war. "How many people?" she asked quietly. "How many people in leadership had to know for this to work?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," David replied. "But Jessica, if it goes high enough, if people I've trusted for years are involved, I might have to burn down the entire executive structure. We might lose everything." She reached across the desk and took his hand, her grip firm. "We built this once from nothing," she said. "If we have to build it again, at least this time we'll know exactly who to trust." Which is apparently fewer people than we thought. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of Judgment Day, and David walked into the conference room where his executive team had gathered, all of them looking pleased with themselves in ways that made his skin crawl. The presentation began exactly as he'd feared, with Linda explaining how strategic supplier partnerships had dramatically improved margins, while maintaining what she carefully called customer satisfaction metrics. Richard chimed in with projected annual savings, numbers that looked impressive on slides but represented thousands of customers being lied to with every meal. David let them talk, let them present their fraud as innovation. Watched them congratulate each other on efficiency gains that were actually systematic deception. When they finished, there was an expectant silence, everyone waiting for his approval, his praise, his validation that they'd done well. Instead, he opened his laptop and turned it around so they could all see the screen. It showed a photograph Claire had sent him that morning. A freezer box with 2 labels, the fake premium label on top and the real discount supplier label underneath, both clearly visible in high resolution. The timestamp showed it was taken at their flagship location just 48 hours ago. "There was an auditor in 4 of our locations this weekend," David said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room go very still. "She found systematic product fraud, falsified labeling, supplier substitution without disclosure, and documentation of organized deception across multiple locations and state lines. In approximately," he checked his watch, "6 hours, she'll be submitting her findings to both our legal team and to federal regulators." The silence that followed was profound. The kind of silence that happens when reality suddenly rearranges itself and no one knows what the new shape looks like yet. Richard recovered first, his face shifting from shock to defense with practiced ease. "David, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he started, but David cut him off with a raised hand. "The only misunderstanding," he said quietly, "was mine. I misunderstood the kind of people I'd surrounded myself with. I misunderstood how far some of you were willing to compromise every principle this company was built on. I misunderstood how much you thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care." He stood up, gathering his laptop, and looked at each executive in turn. "Legal will be contacting each of you individually. I'd suggest you get your own representation, because the company's lawyers will not be representing your interests anymore. As of this moment, anyone involved in authorizing, implementing, or concealing this fraud is on administrative leave pending investigation. You have 1 hour to clear your offices." Linda found her voice, and it came out sharp with panic. "You're going to destroy this company over some supplier optimization? Do you know what this will do to our stock price, our reputation, our expansion plans?" David paused at the door and looked back at her with something between pity and disgust. "I'm not destroying the company," he replied. "You already did that. I'm just the one who has to clean up the mess and try to salvage what's left. And Linda?" He let the silence stretch. "The reputation you're worried about? That's my father's name. That's my family's legacy. And I will burn every dollar we've ever made before I let people like you turn it into a lie." He walked out, leaving behind a conference room full of executives who were just beginning to understand that their CEO had been serious about principles, and that his willingness to lose everything was about to cost them everything instead. The next 72 hours were a controlled demolition. Claire's report landed on federal desks by Tuesday afternoon, complete and damning. David's legal team, armed with documentation that made defense impossible, began negotiating settlements and cooperation agreements. 3 executives were terminated outright, including Richard and Linda. 5 others were placed on probation with oversight. 2 managers from individual locations were fired, but granted limited immunity in exchange for testimony about how the system had been implemented and who had trained them to execute it. The media caught wind by Wednesday, and the headlines were exactly as brutal as David had anticipated. Stone's seafood in crisis, fraud allegations rock restaurant empire, CEO discovers own company's deception. The stock price, which had been climbing steadily for 2 years, dropped 38% in a single day. Investors demanded his resignation. Board members who'd been praising efficiency metrics last week suddenly acted like they'd had concerns all along. Through it all, David did something that shocked the industry consultants and crisis management experts his PR team brought in. He told the truth, completely and without spin. He released a video statement that didn't minimize or deflect, that simply acknowledged what had happened, took responsibility as the CEO who should have caught it sooner, and outlined exactly what steps were being taken to fix it. "We betrayed your trust," he said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that hadn't seen much sleep. "We charged premium prices for inferior product, and we did it systematically across multiple locations. That's fraud, and there's no other word for it. I'm the CEO, which means I'm ultimately responsible, even though I didn't authorize it." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, from contrition to determination. "Here's what happens now. Every location is being re-audited. Every supplier contract is being renegotiated with complete transparency. Every employee is being retrained on quality standards and given protection to report violations without retaliation. "We're refunding any customer who purchased seafood at our restaurants in the past 18 months. No questions asked, no proof of purchase required. If you ate at Stone's during that time, we owe you money, and we're going to pay it." The financial analysts say he was insane. He was unnecessarily expanding liability, that settlements should be fought, not volunteered. But something unexpected happened in the 48 hours after that video went live. It went viral, but not in the way corporate disasters usually did. People shared it not with outrage, but with something close to respect, commenting on how rare it was to see a CEO actually take responsibility instead of hiding behind lawyers and PR spin. Restaurant workers from other companies began posting their own stories of being pressured to cut corners, of fraud they'd witnessed, of systematic problems in the industry that everyone knew about but no one talked about. David's phone call confession became a flashpoint for a larger conversation about transparency and accountability in food service. By Friday, something even stranger occurred. Customers started showing up at Stone's locations, specifically because of the scandal, wanting to support a company that had owned its mistakes and was trying to fix them. Sales, which had initially crashed, began recovering. Not to previous levels, not even close, but enough to suggest that maybe there was a path forward after all. Malcolm called him that night, his voice carrying bemused approval. "You're either the luckiest idiot I've ever met," he said, "or you accidentally discovered something every crisis consultant gets paid millions to fake. People actually trust honesty more than perfection. Who knew?" David sat in his office, the same office where he'd spent that sleepless night uncovering the fraud, and looked at the framed photo of his father on the fishing boat, weathered face split, with a gap-toothed grin. "I think my dad knew," he replied quietly. "He just didn't have a word for it besides doing right." The rebuilding took months, slow and expensive and frequently frustrating. David brought in new executives, people with track records of transparency, and implemented systems that made fraud logistically difficult and whistleblowing protected and encouraged. Stone's Seafood didn't return to its former size, at least not in the first year. 8 locations closed permanently, unable to weather the revenue loss during the crisis. The stock price stabilized but remained depressed. Competitors seized market share with aggressive marketing that subtly referenced the scandal without naming it directly. But something else happened too. The customers who stayed became fiercely loyal, the kind of loyalty that doesn't come from marketing, but from witnessing integrity under pressure. Industry publications began running profiles not about the scandal itself, but about the recovery, using Stone's as a case study in crisis management done right. Food service ethics courses started teaching the Lobster incident as an example of how quickly fraud becomes systemic and how leadership response determines whether companies survive their own failures. David found himself invited to speak at culinary schools and business programs. Talking about the night 2 waitresses casually mentioned fake labels, and everything changed. 13 months after that Booth 7 dinner, David sat in the same flagship location, same booth even, and ordered the lobster tail. Amy, the waitress who'd unknowingly triggered everything, brought it to his table with a smile that suggested she'd heard the stories, but hadn't quite connected them to that random maintenance guy from over a year ago. He cut into the lobster and knew immediately this was the real thing, fresh, premium, exactly what customers were paying for. It shouldn't have felt like a victory, it should have felt like basic competence, but after everything that had happened, it felt like vindication. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Board approved the expansion proposal," it read. 3 new locations, full transparency contracts, ethics oversight built in from day 1. "You're officially rebuilding the empire, just like you said you would. Told you we'd know who to trust this time." David looked around the dining room, at servers who now worked with clear standards and protected reporting systems, at customers eating meals they could actually trust, at a business that had been stripped down to its foundation and rebuilt with the principles he'd almost lost sight of. His father would have approved, not of the fraud that nearly destroyed everything, but of the willingness to burn it all down rather than live with the loss. Sometimes the only way to save something worth saving is to be willing to lose it completely, and David Stone had learned that lesson the hard way, one fake lobster label at a time. The empire he was rebuilding wouldn't be as big as the one that had crumbled, at least not yet, but it would be real. And in an industry built on trust, real was the only currency that actually mattered. He finished his meal, left a tip that made Amy's eyes widen, and walked out into the Portland evening with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd fought a war and survived, scarred but standing. Behind him, The restaurant hummed with honest business, and ahead of him the future waited to be rebuilt, one principle at a time, exactly the way his father had taught him before he ever served his first customer from that original food truck. The lobster had been excellent, premium quality, worth every penny, and David Stone, CEO of Stone's Seafood Company, knew without question that it was exactly what the label said it was, because he'd personally made sure that lying about it would never be worth the cost again.